Great. So thank you for joining us and welcome to this webinar where we will be launching the special edition of Drug Policies and Development, Conflict and Coexistence. This is a special issue of the International Development Policy Journal. We have a range of South African and European presenters with expertise ranging from drug policy, public health, and harm reduction. The session will start with some opening remarks from Professor Hugo, followed by Professor Hausler. Martin Demari will give an introduction to the journal, and this will be followed by a panel discussion, which will include presentations from Professor Julia Buxton, Dr. Anna Versfeld, Mr. Shaun Shelly, and Mr. Martin Jelsma. And then we have Professor Qurraisha Abdool Karim, who will provide closing remarks. So I would like to hand over to Professor Jannie Hugo, who is the head of the University of Pretoria's Department of Family Medicine. He's also the director of the Community-Oriented Primary Care Research Unit. He leads the academic development within that unit and is also the leadership of the Community-Oriented Substance Use Program, which is a collaboration between the City of Tshwane and the Gauteng Department of Health. He's also leading several other surveillance projects. He trained at the University of the Free State and practiced primary care in that province before moving to Medunsa and subsequently to the University of Pretoria. So Prof. Hugo, if your electricity is working, over to you. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to take part in this important discussion. From my perspective, substance use and its harms are part of what comes out of a troubled society. And rather than getting rid of the people that are involved, we should rather listen to the message of the problems of substance use. What makes substance use particularly problematic is the schizophrenic approach internationally over more than a century towards substance use and its harm. And if I consider and reflect, I am a white South African man that lived through apartheid and beyond. And during apartheid, we had laws. And if you break that law, you are in trouble. And sitting within that society, my fellow South Africans were put in jail for doing things which I could do without any trouble. This is exactly the same situation with substance use. Last night, I could enjoy a good bottle of white wine with my wife, enjoy that, made sense of it, and I am not in trouble. Fortunately, I don't have harm for it. But alcohol in particular is causing more harm than any of the other substances. But another human being, a fellow citizen of this world, has made a choice for another substance. Unfortunately, he is in jail. His life is ruined, while I live as though life is perfect. So I want to say this issue is not just a policy and law. The approach behind the policy, and it is on a similar level than the Black Lives Matter issue. It's international, and we should start to say, people who use substances, their lives matter. And I want to say, discussion and the movement that is around it become more intensified, become more radical, become more clear, and address the thinking and the approach and the hidden agendas behind this whole approach. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for bringing the realities and framing us around people and the history and where we're coming from, particularly in South Africa. Now I'd like to hand over to Professor Harry Hausler, who is a family physician, HIV clinician, and preventive medicine specialist with 27 years of international public health experience. He's currently the CEO of TB HIV Care, an organization that participates in implementation science research, provides TB and HIV services across the prevention and treatment cascade to the general and key populations, including people who use drugs. He's also the chair of the South African TB task team of the National TB Think Tank. He's a member of the South African HIV Think Tank and a member of the World Health Organization Civil Society Task Force on TB. Harry.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Jannie, for your opening remarks. So one of the focus area for TB HIV care is to empower communities to be healthy and free of TB and HIV. And if we are really serious about trying to end the HIV and TB epidemics globally, as has been committed to in the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to ensure that we reach people with health services, including key populations, and amongst them people who use and inject drugs. And what struck me, since we've, as an organization, as TB HIV Care, since we've started to deliver services to people who inject drugs since 2013, is how there are so many roadblocks to implementation, and often from communities who are unwilling or who don't understand what the response is, and can't make sense of distribution of clean needles and syringes for people who inject drugs, because they say you're just encouraging drug use, and they don't understand that it's an effective intervention to prevent transmission of HIV and hepatitis. But more importantly, I think, is our experience with mobile peer-led outreach services for different key populations, including sex workers and people who inject drugs, and employing people who have the lived experience that Jannie spoke about of being oppressed by society, not being understood by society, being harassed by law enforcement. I was so amazed when we first started to deliver these mobile outreach services, how even sometimes our mobile clinic would be trailed by the police, and then our clients would be targeted after we had delivered health services to them. And so we really had to engage with law enforcement officials to explain to them that we are delivering health services and that ultimately this is for the benefit of communities. And it's only by caring about people and understanding where they're at, meeting them where they are, and understanding the stresses of their lives, that we can then start engaging with providing both essential health services, harm reduction services, and linkage to psychosocial support, so that they don't have the same need, let's say, to escape into their drugs, and to also give options for coming out of injection into opiate substitution treatment programs, for example. I was also really very distressed when both in the Cape Metro and in eThekwini, we had local ward councillors who started complaining about us providing services and actually blocking access for our clinical teams and psychosocial teams to deliver these services. And it was very frustrating, this political interference. And this is despite the fact that the National Strategic Plan that was endorsed by government and multiple government ministers and the deputy president, which included harm reduction services and where we had funding from the global fund to deliver these, still local politicians obstructed our service delivery. So I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar, and thanks for raising these important issues, because there really is, there's both an epidemiological and a human rights imperative to deliver harm reduction interventions. And also, if you think about the wasted time and energy and resources to criminalize people, these resources could be used so much more effectively if we could implement harm reduction services and link people to the prevention and treatment services that they need to live healthy lives. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Harry. So I think you framed the importance of engaging with critical stakeholders from law enforcement and also people with political decision-making power. And I think that frames one of the areas of what this special issue tried to do, is to bring different perspectives of drug policy and how it impacts on people. So I'd now like to ask Martin de Marie to give an overview of the journal. So Martin joined the International Development Policy Journal in a temporary capacity. He is replacing a colleague who's currently on maternity leave. He's got a history of working in the humanitarian field, and today he's concentrating on raising his family in Geneva and undertakes short assignments. And he's been with the Graduate Institute since the beginning of the year. Martin.
Yes, I'm very happy to represent here the International Development Policy Journal. It's briefly, it's a peer-reviewed journal, so we are aiming to have a certain quality in everything we publish. It's open access, which means that it can be accessed around the world for free, which is also very important. And we publish policy-relevant research from different points of view, disciplinary angles. We try to nourish reflection and debates in the fields of international development and cooperation. We seek original content from authors all over the world, and we have currently a network of about 350 contributors from about 50 countries. In the last 10 years, we have published 22 issues. 13 of them were thematic issues, including the one that we are talking about now. That makes about 400 articles contributions. As I prepared this, I was looking at the statistics. It's very interesting that 42% of these articles, of these 400 articles that we've been publishing for 10 years now, have been downloaded more than 1,000 times in 2020. So there is a lot of demand for these articles, even very old ones. We also have a policy to publish articles from different linguistic regions in local languages and with English translations as much as possible so that we can have a global audience. In 2020, we also had another thematic issue, which was examining the health and economic consequences of COVID-19 in the Global South. It's called COVID-19 in Developing Economies, and this was jointly published with the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. I will share in the comments our two websites. One of them is the blog, and the other one is where we put our publications in open access. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think now we move on to the section of the panel discussion, and opening this will be Professor Julia Buxton. She is the British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, and is also Senior Research Associate at the Global Drug Policy Observatory at the University of Swansea, and is a Regional Head of Oxford Analytica. Her academic and policy research focus on development and security, with a geographical focus on Latin America and thematic interests in drugs, gender, and violence. She's published widely around drug policy. Julia, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. The introduction always makes people important, and I would just say basically I'm somebody who's deeply, deeply concerned about the impacts of drug policy enforcement. As the opening person on this panel, I would just really like to thank you for organising this for us today and for the opportunity to connect and network with our colleagues in South Africa. So very, very many thanks to you. And also, obviously, to the International Development Policy Journal for their work in supporting the dissemination. I'm just going to make a couple of very quick points about what we aim to do in this journal, because it's very important for me to hear more from the South African experience. So basically, what we aim to capture in this special edition is the immense obstacles that repressive criminalization-based drug policies create for development, and particularly here, human development broadly understood. And what many of these chapters are trying to engage with and articulate is these impacts of drug policy enforcement. And what many of us are arguing in this special edition is that these reinforce structural, gendered, racial, and global inequalities and stigma that the Sustainable Development Goals actually claim to address or to seek to address. Now, the big challenge I think that many of us have who are working in this field is that the Sustainable Development Goals claim that no one will be left behind. But what drug policy actually says is that it's completely legitimate to allow this whole swathe of the population to be left behind because these people's behavior is immoral, these people's behavior is criminal, it's bad, it's wrong. So if we're going to be serious about development, and if we are to be serious about no one being left behind, then we really need to be honest about the fact that drug policy has failed. It should not be controversial to say that both in terms of containing illicit markets and enabling access to essential medicines, this global framework has simply not delivered. What we have instead is a deeply unsophisticated, arcane international policy system. And this system is no longer fit for purpose. And we can see this in how catastrophically unsophisticated criminalization-based drug policies are. The metrics of international drug control do not address development. Stakeholders who would be pivotal to any evidence-driven policy process are simply excluded. We have an excellent chapter in this edited collection from Anne Fordham. We can't talk about stakeholder engagement in drug policy as long as people are criminalized, stigmatized, and excluded. It's fiscally inefficient. And the real problem for me around drug policy is that it sits in a silo, completely detached from human rights-based approaches, gender sensitivity, conflict sensitivity, all of these United Nations principles and the emphasis within the international community on creating these rights-based approaches is simply rejected within the international drug policy framework. There's no room for these kinds of narratives, debates, or political negotiations. But we're persisting, or we find ourselves persisting with this international drug policies for reasons that are not about policy. This is, I think, the major challenge that so many of us who work in this field have, because we persist with this drug policy for political reasons, for ideological reasons, because of dogmatism, because of institutional sclerosis, but most importantly, because these policies serve the purposes of those people who wish to maintain and perpetuate gendered, racial, and global inequalities that divide us. As I said at the beginning, it shouldn't be controversial to say this anymore, and we need more people engaging in this campaign and lobby for a complete overhaul of this system. And I think what many of us have found rather disappointing is that people we would expect to be key allies here, and particularly in the development community, particularly in the women's movement, have been very, very reluctant for reputational concerns or for various issues to engage with the seriousness of this issue and how it really is in the interests of their stakeholders and their constituents for them to be engaged in drug policy reform. So my final point here before handing over to colleagues is that what we've really tried to do with here, and what I've done in my chapter, is we work with these constructs of the global north and global south. Now, this is not intended as a geographical framing. This is really a concept which is used to reflect the very different historical and social and political and cultural traditions, but it also speaks to the exclusion and marginalization as the traditional developed world, the global north. Now, what we're really trying to emphasize is the unity, what binds us all of us together here in understanding that this system of discrimination and racism and the gendered inequalities that this creates completely contradicts everything that we are trying to achieve with the Sustainable Development Goals. And until we're able to have the evidence, better conversations, enhanced metrics, and meaningful stakeholder engagement, then unfortunately, international drug policy will continue to be an arcane, early 20th century anathema, which holds us back on so many of these very, very important global development objectives. So on that note, I will hand over to my colleagues on the panel and thank everybody once again for joining us in this very, very important discussion.
Thank you, Julia. So I think that just highlights how important at the global level these discussions are and how the historical framing and perpetuation really affects the global South, and we put South Africa firmly in that area. So Anna Versfeld will be talking on the chapter which focuses on South Africa, which is around prohibitionist drug policy and the reasons and its effects. Anna is an independent South African medical anthropologist. Her work focuses on gender, infectious diseases, and key populations, with a specialization in the social dynamics of tuberculosis and substance use. She currently works with a variety of organizations that are involved in health research and project implementation. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cape Town and is a technical assistant to the Stop TB Partnership. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to present our paper in a complete summary and simplification to some degree, but I hope the conversations will pick up on the bits that I leave out. And I think really what Shaun, Andrew, and I were trying to do here was fight against this assumption that we see in our work and our research every day, that international policy is neutral, it's for the greater common good, and it's evidence-based. And our paper uses a South African example to show that this is simply not true for prohibitionist drug policy, which is rather, as we've heard so far, morally driven. It meets the needs of those in power. And not only is it counter to individual rights, it really has overt negative impacts on health interventions and health outcomes. So I'm going to start with a small example of cannabis that we have in the paper. Prohibition stretched back in South Africa to 1870, to the Natal colony. And these were put in place because of concerns that cannabis use was undermining the discipline and the obedience of labor. And it was also, the trade was encouraging different races to mix. And so the legislation was put in place for those concerns. And it was in fact South Africa that successfully then requested the Council of the League of Nations to include cannabis as an internationally banned substance. And later, the apartheid government was deeply conservative and with a sort of grounding Christian moralism of the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a very conservative form of Christianity. So along with the racist sentiments, the moralism underlying the growing international prohibition movements, which were led by the United States and really shaped by the temperance movement, resonated with the South African apartheid government and the ongoing racist policies. So in post-apartheid South Africa, we've developed a constitution. We have a constitution that provides for the rights of all individuals. But in terms of our drug policy, the acts that have been established post-apartheid have really fallen along the lines of the 1961 Single Convention, which aims to eradicate drug use through punitive measures. This has been evident in our successive national drug master plans, though the recent one does demonstrate some shifts, which I think we get to. And this prohibition justifies stigma and discrimination of people who use drugs in all sectors, including in the health sector. And this has some very real examples, and I'm largely going to draw out health examples. But people incarcerated for minor drug offences, never mind just how terrifying this is, marginalised young men of colour are targeted, and it results in criminal records that foreclose life and poverty. And prisoners are also exposed to tuberculosis infections. So we're actually placing people at risk in that way, but we're also placing people at risk in other ways. So people who inject drugs are put at risk of hepatitis C, HIV infection, if they cannot habitually and all the time access sterile injecting equipment. And when efforts to this end are stopped by law enforcement, as we have seen happen, people who use drugs and who need care are denied it. They're actively denied it in healthcare provision settings, or they're simply discriminated against enough or treated badly enough that they simply no longer return for care. Or in cases of opioid dependence, people are not provided with the substitution therapy they need to stabilize enough to take their other medication. So while we see the health sector is making some important shifts towards harm reduction, coherent change across the sectors is hampered by international influence. The United States still funds and leads a really punitive international approach to substance use control, and that has massive profits going to the defense industry and to businesses. And the profits of illegal money, the legal trade the money is laundered through northern banks. In South Africa, we've very clearly seen how Russian economic incentives have played a role in maintaining a prohibitionist approach to drugs. We have also made an argument in the paper that change is hamstrung, and this point has been made already, but really by the fragmented nature of the Central Drug Authority, which is the main policy-making institution, which is tasked with managing completely conflicting mandates and perspectives. And so what we argue for in the paper is very clearly for decriminalization, for a pragmatic, evidence-based harm reduction approach to substance use. And we note there have been recent important shifts, not least the decriminalization of the possession of the use of cannabis in private spaces. And our paper seeks to provide impetus to these movements. That's it for me.
Great, thank you, Anna. So what we will do is we'll go through the other panelists, and then I will pose some questions to each panelist, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So that then leads us to Shaun Shelly, who is a researcher at the University of Pretoria's Department of Family Medicine. He's also the Policy, Advocacy and Human Rights Lead at TB HIV Care, and the chair of the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs. Shaun brings academic, pragmatic research, clinical and lived experience together in a 360-degree view of the complex issues that inform understanding of and responses to the use of certain drugs, as well as the people who use them. And we've asked Shaun to give some perspectives in relation to people who use drugs. Over to you, Shaun.
There are 3 points that I want to make today. And the first point is that when it comes to drug policy, a simple principle should be applied. And that is nothing about us without us. And that's borrowed from the disability sector. The voices of people who use drugs must be included in policy making, and they must inform not only policy, but research. They must inform any interventions that involve people who use drugs, and they must inform the literature that we consult all the time. In my opinion, they should also be, the voices and people who use drugs should also be included in the design of programs. In South Africa, we've had some serious issues because we haven't included the voice of people who use drugs. For example, the absolute myth that Niobe is ARVs would easily have been disproven right at the very beginning before it took traction if they had consulted with people who use drugs in a broader context and got some information from them, because there's no person on the street who uses Niobe who's going to accept a crushed up ARV in place of heroin. They will suffer withdrawal symptoms. They will know very quickly that it's not proper Niobe or heroin, and complain about that. And those conversations were never had when these myths were formulated. Another example would be the Bluetoothing myth that was extensively reported on, and really in reality an isolated, but ran the problem of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. The problem with including people who use drugs in the discussion and the conversation is that there's this misnomer that people who are capable of autonomous decisions or sensible decision making. This is simply not true. And this highlights another one of the dangers, is that while medical services for people who use drugs are essential, and they suffer from particular ailments which are more prevalent and need special interventions, people who use drugs in general are not sick people. There's no need to pathologize people who use drugs. The vast majority of people who use drugs will never need treatment. The vast majority will resolve their problematic drug use by themselves if they're in the right context. And so we must be very careful that we're not turning prisoners into patients in the name of human rights and getting rid of stigma. Because really, a prison sentence is a fixed sentence, but when somebody is told that they've got a lifelong disease of the brain, which if left untreated, they will die of, that's a life sentence to them, and it disregards their voice and their autonomy. The third point that I want to make is tied to these other points. Drug policy does not need a radical sort of reform, except in one way in South Africa. And that is that drug policy must align with the Constitution. The Zondo judgment, which was made regarding cannabis, doesn't only hold true for cannabis, it actually holds true for all other drugs, because the harms related to prohibition far outweigh the harms of any other harm that could possibly come from the drugs on a large macro level. And so we need to simply, I say, it's not a simple task, but we need to simply align drug policy with our Constitution, because if it aligns with the Constitution, we won't be criminalizing people who use drugs. We'll be providing a continuum of services, and we will listen to the voices of people who use drugs. So in summary, I want to say, drug policy is a fundamental barrier to achieving a free and equitable South Africa. To redress the harms caused by current policies, we must see people who use drugs as neither prisoners nor patients, but as people with the right to participate in all decisions that impact on their lives, health, and freedom. As with all laws and policies, we must align our drug policies with our Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting the rights and the importance of our Constitution, and particularly around non-discrimination and supporting and moving away from inequities. And I think what's important is around the cannabis discussion and how that can be used for transformation more broadly. And that gives us the segue into Martin Jelsma, who's going to talk around cannabis fair trade and some of the developments that are happening globally, as well as relevance to Africa and Southern Africa. And Martin is the director of the Drugs and Democracy program at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. He's also a senior researcher at the Global Drug Policy Observatory at the Swansea University, and he's working on the UN drug control system and the links between drug policies, conflict, human rights, and development. And his work is often done in collaboration with small farmers who farm cannabis, coca, and opium. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Andrew. And yeah, and of course, thanks to the for organizing this panel. Also, thanks to the journal for yeah, it has been quite an effort to get this whole volume together, and I can really recommend everybody to yeah, to take a look at it, because it has a whole wide spectrum of yeah, chapters on different aspects of the link between drugs and development issues. So the chapter that I wrote together with Dave Booley-Taylor and Sylvia Kay focuses on a specific part of the cannabis regulation debate, because also the illicit cannabis economy now has for millions of people in marginalized rural areas in the south has served as a survival economy. So how to deal with that reality in many countries are starting to change their cannabis policies and are starting, to move towards a legally regulated market. So the question in the chapter is, how to do that in such a way that it takes on board social justice and fair trade principles, and to enable those small farmers that have been dependent on this illicit market, how to enable them to transition from illegality into the new legal spaces of the global cannabis market. So the landscape internationally around cannabis is changing rapidly. By now there are like 40 plus countries that have introduced some form of medical regulation, and already a multi-billion-dollar industry has been built around it. Some countries have started to go beyond the medical. Quite a lot of states in the US, also after the recent elections, several new states within the US have fully legalized also non-medical use of cannabis. But before that, already Uruguay and Canada. There's a debate at the moment going on in Mexico about it. They have to approve a legal regulation law before the 15th of December. New Zealand, well, just lost the referendum for a similar law, but it was a very small margin, and we expect that discussion to go forward as well. And in Europe, also in Luxembourg and in my country, the Netherlands, the debate is moving further along in the direction of legal regulation. So this trend that is going very rapidly in the last few years, and is not going to stop, and it is creating also tensions at the UN level, because it of course challenges the whole UN drug control system, and there is also an opposition to the countries that see this as a threat to the existence of the global prohibition regime itself. It is a very positive development now, because it brings more science into policy. It tries to correct an historical error, because in our opinion, cannabis as a plant never belonged in the international treaty system from the start. But it also, it was from the start based on in the colonial era, racist principles, etc. So it is time to repair, in that sense, the history and the mistakes made around cannabis policy. So the big fear, and that is expressed also in our chapter, is that what is going on at the moment is a corporate capture of these new legal spaces in the market. So northern companies are moving in very quickly, especially in the medical sphere, and are taking over and are starting new cultivation to supply these new legal market spaces globally. So what happens is that there is till now hardly no access for the small farmers that have been producing for the market to enter the legally regulated market. That is the issue which needs to be looked at and with some urgency, because once the new corporations that are moving in have really established themselves firmly in the market, it will be very difficult to still give access to small farmers. So how did looking at the situation in South Africa now, of course, not only globally, but also in the case of South Africa, the prohibition of cannabis is very clearly rooted in racism. There's a strong link with the apartheid regime. And it has also, it is in that sense a good example of a survival economy also in the rural areas. Now it's mainly in the east, the previous Xhosa and Zulu Bantustans, but also in Swaziland or Swatini and Lesotho, in Mapondoland. Those are all areas where thousands and thousands of small farmers are still producing for the are still dependent on cultivating cannabis. It is now mainly for the domestic market. Now, the previous role that South Africa also played for export is already diminishing, but still a lot of farmers in the east of South Africa are still dependent on cannabis cultivation. So there needs to be a place for them in the future, and that is indeed one of the weaknesses of the decriminalization bill as it is now introduced. Shaun already referred to it, that it is focused on cultivation for personal use, possession, but does not in any way give also a way out for the small farmers that are still being criminalized and whose fields are still regularly eradicated and their livelihoods destroyed. So I'll end it there, though. That I think for South Africa it is an important issue to overcome this legacy of colonial rule and racism, and we hope really that this discussion that has now started around the bill will continue and will go into the direction using also social justice and fair trade principles that allow also small farmers in the country to transition out of illegality and get a legal income from this market. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think it's really important to highlight those areas in South Africa that are often underdeveloped, rural, and particularly marginalized, and how what happens at the level of policy and legislation has specific and direct impacts on them. So thank you very much for the panelists for your brief overviews. I'm just going to now direct a question to each of you, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. So starting with Julia. Julia, so this is a fantastic special edition that's been pulled together with diverse perspectives and geographic coverage. But practically, what is the way in which this journal and the articles and this discussion could potentially be used to further drug policy reform in South Africa and also in Africa?
Well, anybody who works in academia will tell you that we spend most of our lives writing books that sit on dusty shelves that nobody ever reads, or we produce journal articles for publishing houses that are paywalled and very expensive and completely inaccessible for people. I think what we're trying to do with this journal in terms of advocacy is ensure that there is wide availability, and the fact we've been able to publish this open access is really, really important. It just means that, you know, as the words imply, it's open for people to be able to access this who wouldn't normally be able to kind of be, you know, necessarily engaging with these debates. The chapters are lengthy, and we acknowledge that, but what we're trying to do here is provide a very, very rich form of debate. And the key thing here is bringing together people who work in social sciences, medical sciences, people from the NGO and the policy world and the practitioners. And also, you know, this term that some people find rather contestable, people with lived experience, and trying to reflect all of this together is very, very important. The key thing for me in terms of this advocacy emphasis is really trying to emphasize that, yes, certainly there are your debates currently in South Africa, but similarly, this is an international policy. So however it reproduces inequality and exclusion really takes on those national or cultural characteristics. So whether you're in Ghana, whether you're in Bulgaria, whether you're in Uruguay, although perhaps not the best example, But the key thing is that it's these different national forms of exclusion and stigma that are constantly reproduced. So the key thing here in terms of the advocacy is trying to bring together a diverse, but also to emphasize here the diversity and the global nature of this problem. Because until we understand, absolutely, it's fantastic that we're having these steps forward in some parts of the world in drug policy reform, but in other parts of the world, we're seeing, you know, if we look at what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in Bangladesh. So we need to understand how we can all work together and support each other, because this really, for me, is the key thing. We can't just be locked by, you know, the national dimensions of what this problem is. If we're to have international and global sustainable development goals, we need to have an international response to how drug policy impedes the sustainable development goals. So in terms of the advocacy, for me, it's about bringing people together and enabling networks that our traditional disciplinary or, you know, academic policy world divides usually precludes. And that's the reason why we're so delighted to be able to publish this as an open access journal.
Thank you. And we'll do what we can and encourage others to disseminate it widely and just highlight that it's not just a South African issue, it's regional, continental, and global. And I think, Anna, because you focused on the South African context and you made some reference to the policy developments that have happened, you know, are there any windows that exist around transformation? You know, have there been any policy changes in South Africa that can be moved forward towards implementation? Any perspectives or recent developments that you would like to highlight, or your thoughts around that?
Okay, so perhaps I need to just start with how far we've come since the last National Drug Master Plan. And I have this in front of me, and I'm going to read it because it's, I think it's sort of a policy version of alternative facts. Because in our previous National Drug Master Plan, we had a localized definition of harm reduction, which was defined as limiting or ameliorating the damage caused to individuals or communities who have already succumbed to the temptation of substance abuse. So this is so far from the international definition that it just, there was no option of having a harm reduction approach when that is your definition of harm reduction. And in the new National Drug Master Plan, we now have I actually don't have it in front of me, but we have a definition of harm reduction, which is far more aligned with international norms and standards. So that's a massive step. And that allows us to start moving in the direction of harm reduction. Unfortunately, the new National Drug Master Plan doesn't set out indicators or map out a concrete way for us to take a harm reduction approach. And that's a real lack, because without indicators if we're not measuring it, it's very unlikely to happen. I think it still has, it's got a strong biomedical focus. So it's substance abuse it still uses is a disease. And I think we sometimes forget that disease is stigmatized. Simply because you take something from being morally wrong to somebody being diseased doesn't make them not stigmatized. And it hides the social dynamics of substance use. So I think one of the issues is that we are not yet foregrounding how and why substance use happens, and that it largely happens in problematic ways, in conditions of marginalization. So we've taken some steps forward. We're not quite there yet. I think the fact that people who use drugs were consulted in the process is incredibly important. I think the fact that there doesn't seem to be a consistent inclusion of people using drugs in monitoring the process is really problematic. But we've taken huge steps. So we've started some momentum, and we need to move with that. I think also we've had an interesting situation this year where COVID-19 has shown us just how much can be done very, very quickly if we're committed to it. And we can make shifts if we have the commitment.
Thank you. Very interesting points, and good to hear the positive change in the overarching drug policy. I think, Shaun, what I'd like to put to you is, one is some of the concerns or areas of expansion in relation to the current bill, the draft cannabis bill, and also if you can build on what Anna alluded to, some of the developments that have happened in the context of COVID, particularly those that have led to positive change that can move forward around drug policy and services in South Africa.
Okay, so I think COVID has been quite interesting. What for me was particularly interesting is it didn't even make a dent in the drug market whatsoever. Prices remained the same, availability remained the same, which shows the futility of trying to focus on supply side reduction. What it also showed was that in a number of settings, we were able to include the voices of people who use drugs in the sort of interventions or the response to COVID. We've written a bit about that in one paper. And as Prof. Hugo will know, and it was reported by the city of Swansea that people who use drugs were instrumental in the response. And the same happened in eThekwini to some degree, which is excellent. I think another thing that came sort of out of that, but also out of broader discussions over several years, was the formal statement by the Department of Social Development to include a partnership with the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs as a formal partnership going forward. Unfortunately, that doesn't translate into the National Drug Master Plan, although the plan itself does call for that, but the implementation is done by the Central Drug Authority, and the Central Drug Authority selection process is happening at the moment, and there's not one person who identifies as a person who uses drugs in that process. In fact, it precludes people who use drugs from the process, and also there's no voice of harm reduction within the 13 members who've been selected to go forward for the Central Drug Authority, and that's something which I'm formally think is ridiculous. Andrew, in my sorry, the first part, Andrew?
Just about the cannabis bill.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, the problems with the cannabis bill are that it doesn't take in the rural producer, it doesn't take into account the economies that are dependent on cannabis, usually very marginalized populations who living in rural areas, who get their crops sprayed regularly by glyphosate, and the move towards increasing criminal sanctions for people who fall outside these mystery limits, which nobody can really explain in what you're allowed to possess and not. You can get more for so-called cannabis dealing than you would for murder in some cases, and that's just unacceptable. You can't sort of increase the penalties on one hand and talk about human rights and decriminalization on the other hand, and then also ever legal regulation of cannabis. And I'm particularly worried that we're going to see a very kind of uber capitalist takeover of the cannabis industry that's going to actually exclude a lot of people and police those people far more through the legal processes than the police have even been able to do in the past. The important thing out of the cannabis bill though, is that in a reduction of 152,000 arrests, and the sky still hasn't fallen on our heads. So I think
Thank you. So keeping with cannabis, I think just Martin, at the UN level, there's currently an intense debate around the classification of cannabis under the UN conventions, and there's a vote coming up in early December. Can you just explain briefly what's at stake and how South Africa positioned itself in that debate?
Sure, yeah, it is a fascinating discussion that is going on. A boiling point in Vienna, where the vote will take place on December the 2nd. That cannabis entered the treaty system without a clear review process by the World Health Organization, WHO. That is the requirement. No, normally there is a classification system with different schedules under the UN drug control ability to recommend which belongs in which schedule and what level of control internationally the different substances require. So that has never occurred in the case of cannabis, that entered the treaty system without a proper review. Anna already referred to the role before the Second World War to put cannabis on the international level and to push for it in an earlier treaty under the League of Nations. So what is happening now is in that sense historical, because it is for the first time since 1925 that there is a proper critical review of cannabis that the WHO, the expert committee of the WHO, has conducted. It's a very serious, profound review with looking at all the existing literature and coming up with recommendations to change the classification of cannabis under the treaty system as it stands. And that has created huge tension. So already twice the vote has been postponed. The different blocks are still positioning themselves. And even though the WHO recommendations are not going that far, no? They're not proposing to take cannabis out of the schedule altogether. They merely fully recognize the medical properties of cannabis and the different cannabinoids present in the plant, and they want to take it, delete it from the strictest Schedule 4 of the 61 Convention, which but under considerable control requires criminalization of the trade, etc. So it's not going that far, but it is properties, and it is the first time in history that there is a proposal to change and bring it to a somewhat lighter control schedule, and that has created a lot of tensions in Vienna. So very interestingly, the change of position of South Africa in this debate, which is going on already for 2 years. So initially, in fact, South Africa and together with Africa bloc now were pushing very much against these recommendations, have taken defending the prohibitionist regime to the teeth from the mission in Vienna, playing a very negative role. That has completely changed, and that is, I think, really thanks to also local advocacy efforts and taking really more control over this debate and sending proper instructions to the mission in Vienna, because now South Africa has already that they will support the deletion from Schedule 4, that they have acknowledged that they took a wrong position in the past, and they are fully supportive of this process, and that's a remarkable change. And yeah, the Africa bloc in the UN now is completely divided, so they cannot have a common position on this issue and on the vote. In part, thanks to South Africa, who has changed its position in Vienna for the better, and is now supportive of changes in that sense of the cannabis policy also at the UN level.
Great, thank you. So I think it's important to note that there have been positive shifts, and I see that there's someone on the call saying that they are, I think, shortlisted to be on the CDA. That's Peter Acker, and asking for his support and his help to shift the understanding of the Central Drug Authority. So I think in response to that, it's more a comment, is that please pass on this journal to all the members in the CDA that you can engage with and any other people to see what's happening globally and what the evidence is. Then Anne Fordham has posted a question that I'm going to read out. And it's that, as Julia noted, it's been challenging to engage the broader development community in the discussion on drug policy reform, despite how drug policies detrimentally undermine development outcomes. In particular, the nuanced understanding of the illicit drug market as a survival economy for so many people living in situations of economic vulnerability around the world, in urban and rural settings, in the global north and the global south, needs more prominence. Please could the panelists speak to this point and what more can be done to bring greater attention to this aspect as we seek policy reform, especially the movements towards legal regulation. So I think I'm going to just go through each panelist if you'd like. Start with you, Julia, and then I'll move on to Anna, then Shaun, and then Martin.
The point that Anne raises is really central to some of the chapters in the special edition. We have a chapter on Afghanistan by David Mansfield. We've got a very good chapter on cannabis Morocco. And obviously the arguments around free trade that are raised by Martin and Dave in their chapters. I think what I try to argue in my own contribution is that we've had this kind of ongoing tension around how we address informality and the reliance of excluded communities on essentially illicit economies. And throughout the 90s and the 2000s, we had alternative development and development-oriented drug control, alternative livelihoods. We've gone through these constant reiterations of essentially reinventing the wheel of trying to formalize these kind of communities engaged in these criminalized activities. My concern is that the mainstream development orthodoxy is very much emphasizing neoliberal oriented exit solutions from poverty. So it's very much about free trade. It's very much about free market integration. I don't think that these solutions are necessarily appropriate for the types of development responses that we would like to see in these communities, which, you know, as Martin has highlighted, really also has to engage with aspects of free trade and the potential role of some of these plant-based products in formal and legal markets. So I think we need to have, and as Anne's highlighted, a far better conversation about the challenges of informalization and how so many of these communities are inherently reliant on these markets, not because it's an opportunity to make lots of money, but because this is about survival in context of multidimensional poverty. And that multidimensional poverty has to be understood in terms of deficits of citizenship, health, education, markets, capital, infrastructure. It's not just about money. So let's move away from ideas that it's just about trying to compensate for these crops and understand the real role that they play in livelihood survival.
Thank you. Anna, would you like to add your perspective?
I think Julia's done a fantastic response there. But perhaps as an anthropologist, I want to say that as long as we regard drug use as a medical problem, as long as we stop understanding that drug use and trade it's a social dynamic and it's in a political economic context, it's very easy to not regard it as a development problem, to regard it as a health problem or to regard it as a moral problem. And so I would say that we need to be careful about the medicalization of drug use because I think it's got ramifications within the development sector too.
Shaun, would you like to also perhaps expand around the livelihoods of drug sellers? Because I think that's also a really important component, and to dispel some of those myths around who drug sellers are and why they are engaged in drug selling and how this links to their livelihoods, particularly around the context and the reasons why people might use drugs or why drug use might be problematic, and this links with the social determinants of health.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit on the urban setting. So thanks for setting that up there, Andrew, because we have this conceptualization of drug dealers as being people who have flashy cars, lots of cash, are rolling in it and living this hedonistic lifestyle. The reality of the situation is that drug sellers, in large part, are subsistence sellers of drugs. They are forced into finding an economic solution to some severe economic marginalization and difficulties. I would see that a lot more money from the sales of drugs among subsistence sellers goes into buying school shoes than goes into buying fast cars. it is an informal economy that is significant. I like to compare it a little bit to the taxi industry before apartheid, that fulfilled a very essential need, and like it or not, that at this stage drug sellers form an essential need on multiple levels, because people find a lot of meaning and vocation in their drugs, especially in a drug like heroin. It becomes a cycle of vocation, you know, people assume that these people are some part of some large organized crime system, whereas in actual fact they're the expendables within the large systems and the transnational crime systems. And if we don't make allowance for them, we're going to find a severe problem within communities, because we haven't taken into economic contribution that this takes. And it's a very real and large part of it, although it's divided into very small sections. And unless we do that, we're going to have significant problems going forward, I think. Also, what we see is a lot of people use selling drugs as a springboard towards businesses. And most people don't want to be criminalized for their entire lives. Most people want to find freedom where they can actually do openly. But quite frankly, a lot of people that we see who are drug sellers, non-gang affiliated ones, are people who would otherwise be, you know, businessmen or bankers in a different society and in a different context. And so we must be careful not to paint everybody with the same brush and assume that all nothing more than people who are and taking advantage of their local communities, which is obviously different to the people who are running huge, large transnational enterprises and trade. But nothing to do with it. It's just the value chain that makes drugs an attractive proposition.
Thanks. Martin, do you want to add anything additional to what you framed earlier around livelihoods and development?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, and going back to what Julia already referred to as the reality that this prohibition regime has only been able to survive because of the silo that has been built around it. And that's also how it plays out at the UN level. So that silo within the UN system is for Vienna and breaking that further down. That has already started, and one of the ways to do it is also to point out that many of these issues now are not simple policy choices, because they are also rights of and there's a whole range of human rights that are at stake here, and that's also the reason why the issue of drug policy has come up more and more in the human rights. In Geneva, for example, special rapporteurs have more and more also dedicated in various reports, reports about arbitrary detention, but also around discrimination, the right to health. So it is coming up more and more also outside of the silo, and I think that is a way also to force other sectors, so the development and broader human rights community, to look at this as part of their their mandate to that they have to engage with it, because and in Geneva, now there's also rather recently the rights of peasants and other working in rural areas is a declaration that has been adopted in the Human Rights Council. Cultural and indigenous rights. No, that's because it also cannabis. In the case of cannabis, there are centuries of traditions and cultural practices and ceremonial uses and traditional medicinal practices. those cultures are also protected by rights in international instruments. So I think that is one way to do more, to break it further out of this. The issue has been going on too isolated for too long time.
Thank you. And I think the issue of rights is always such an important element in the South African context because of our history of gross rights violations. So I think that's an important area for us to be highlighting more. Prof. Hugo, would you like to give your perspectives? And then...
Yeah, just very shortly. The prohibitionist approach clearly is creating this international currency for crime, which Shaun referred of developmental studies and developmental theories. I'm a layman there, so I wouldn't know, but that would be a very interesting that hampers development and real development. And then at another level, I again want to compare the wine, I don't even want to call it an industry, but the versus the cannabis life, and how the wine industry provides huge economic advantages with potential of development through farm workers and empowerment and etc., where none of that is possible in the cannabis industry because it is criminalized, and to just at development theory level to look at those issues. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions and those comments. So we have time for one more question. I see Ali Fazeda from UNAIDS posed, how can we highlight the need for reviewing drug policy in the context of decolonization? So would anyone like to tackle that?
Andrew, I always say that drug policy is the perpetuation of the imperial and the colonial through the international myth that drugs are bad, and that if we conceptualize drug use as an evil, as it does in the single conventions, it's a very difficult thing to quantify evil, whatever that means, and it then justifies any kind of response. And we see the use of militarized police and in the Western Cape, for example, training of South African police by the DEA and the FBI, which is a form of imperialism and colonialism as far as I'm concerned. They're exporting their failed agency, the local context. And I think that we have to frame it within that concept of decolonization, because that's what's its origin.
Any other panelists want to add to that before we go into closing remarks?
I perhaps have a brief thought, because I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it's an important question. And I think that we need to recognize the extent to which the is a fairly uneducated one when it comes to drug use and the criminalization of drug use. And there is an opportunity to potentially bring leaders in who are leading the decolonization movement, if it can be called a movement, on board by letting people know and understand the colonial nature of drug use. But I think it's about, and it's about not only requiring people in the Central Drug Authority to be correctly educated, but actually potentially bringing other people on board and making sure that people who are leading movements have this on the agenda.
Thanks. Julia, last comment from you before we hand over to Prof.
I was very much echoing what Anna has said there. I would really emphasize that, one of the real challenges I think we have also mechanisms to enable non-traditional forms of social movements to be able to interact both within these wider dialogues and debates, but also within a number of these kind of UN systems and national frameworks. And it's how do we kind of reform in social movements that enables these voices to be heard.
All right, thank you for that important element of around decolonization. So thanks very much to the panelists for all of your inputs and all of your hard work and commitment for the special edition. For closing, I'd like to hand over to Professor Abdool Karim, who is a South African infectious disease epidemiologist. She is the Associate Scientific Director of Qurraisha, which is the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa, and is also a professor in clinical epidemiology at Columbia University. She's the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the African Health at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a UNAIDS Special Ambassador for Adolescents and HIV. She is a member of the USA National Academy of Medicine and Fellow of the World Academy of Science, the African Academy of Science, and the Academy of Science of South Africa. She has over 200 peer-reviewed publications, books, and chapters, and is a great ally, I think, in the work around drug policy. So we're really honored that you could join us today. So I'd like to hand over to you, Prof. Abdool Karim.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and quite a privilege to be part of these deliberations this morning and listening to all the panel members. And I think it, for me, an important point that I wanted to highlight. You know, the special issue could have been, it is open access. There could have been an advert or some way to draw attention to it. And I want to commend the journal editor to launch it linked to these kind of interactive deliberations, because I think that while the special issue has a global view to it, they're very local dynamics that make it unfold in different ways. And this mechanism, I think, has been very of one, keeping both the global context and commonalities, but also enabling for some of the diversity at a local level to come through. And epidemiologist, I should say, you know, the reason I love my science is because it's both science and social justice. And when I think about substance use, I'm also struck by the similarities with other challenges that face us. And I want to just touch on two global challenges that drug use. And that, the first is HIV, that I spend a lot of time with. And the second is COVID-19, which has been also consuming all of our lives in different ways. COVID-19, you will find that common thread of lives, livelihoods, and rights. And in different epidemics, different take prominence. Sometimes it's also an issue of time, because when lives are being lost, whether we're talking about HIV or COVID, the priority becomes. So the livelihoods part may, through extreme measures of lockdown and social isolation, could compromise the livelihoods, and some very harsh measures that need to be put in place in a public health response and in government responses. You can find rights are compromised. And so by how common these three components are, and how we struggle often in terms of where we balance it in, and it does need a balance. It's not a polarization, but it's about striking a balance without compromising any of the different component pieces. And I think in my work with HIV, while I started it off as an epidemiologist, it's become more and more clear, even within a very short space of time, that vulnerable communities and individuals don't have, and this these issues that we've heard of from different lenses, from an economic, socio-political, anthropological, historical, really flag for us an important point in history that we've reached, where globally and locally people are not willing to accept life as it is. For agency in terms of ensuring you live your life to the fullest and have the opportunity to do that without the constraints that are imposed morally or economically that disadvantage particular individuals or societies. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals provide an important overarching framework that perhaps we're not using sufficiently, but could use in terms of addressing multiple challenges, because we're really looking at an intersection of multiple things that may weigh differently in different places, but ultimately it's not a single issue. So even as we think about the rights of people who use drugs and the constraints that are placed on them, I think what we're seeing is the importance of advocacy and the importance of evidence-based advocacy. And this one more. And what we see is when we have evidence-based advocacy and when you have a nexus between science, activism, and bringing policy and practice together, our ability to make a difference is so much more than if we try and perpetuate some of the on. So I just wanted to, I think that, you know, Shaun in his usual way, it just comes to the, the points. And it is that what we do, it has to be in an inclusive way, including those whose lives we're trying to change and benefit. And so whether we're talking HIV, whether we're talking COVID, whether we're talking substance use, we cannot exclude anyone, because, and that some of those exclusions that create stigma and discrimination further marginalize populations. And that as we work together, I think we also have seen in the context of COVID and in HIV, sometimes that in an odd way, these are complex challenges, that the opportunities to change things and transform it come from very interesting spaces. In HIV, for example, it was around antiretroviral treatment access, for example. In the case of people who use drugs in South Africa, not uniformly, but certainly in some cities, we have seen that in trying to contain the spread and delay the rapidity with which SARS-CoV-2 spread, we've seen amazing opportunities for services for people with drugs. that would have been inconceivable even a year or so ago. These were like battle lines drawn, and suddenly in Durban, the city I'm in, we have a safe place to use drugs, and we have needle exchange, and we have homelessness being addressed, and so on. In the midst of all of this, one of the concerns that I have specifically in relation to use is the cannabis part. And I think that Martin really captured it in a way that I'd not heard before, which is about corporate capture. I kept thinking about monetization of something, but corporate actually undermine a bigger movement and for people who use drugs. It's kind of pulls it out, makes the profit, and then criminalizes those who can least afford to, which is individuals, for example, homeless individuals, by creating laws that say, well, just if it's okay if you have enough cannabis on you for personal use. But what about those individuals who are homeless and who may not be able to have that place to just carry around enough for personal use for somebody who may have safe accommodation and secure accommodation? So without distracting and getting too distracted, I just wanted to close by saying, again, underscoring the importance of this process. I think that has been used of sharing a knowledge generation process through a webinar in this interactive way that and a very local approach that allows us to look at issues beyond our borders, but also within our borders. But that we shouldn't forget that we need to strike a good balance in our approaches around lives, livelihoods, and rights. That the Sustainable Development Goals provide an opportunity. We come together and maximize our advocacy efforts, that there are very many common other challenges that face us, both infectious and non-health and not health, that allow our advocacy efforts to get more teeth and ultimately ensure that every person anywhere in the world has the opportunity to reach their full potential and make their full contributions to society and realize what it is that they have to give to society. So with that, Andrew, thanks again for this opportunity and an amazingly rich discussion. And for people who've joined, I hope they've also been enriched by this process. Thank you.
Took time out, so the partners in this was the Graduate Institute, TB HIV Care, University of Pretoria, Qurraisha, the University of Cape Town, and Sandford. And Martin has just sent out the various links for the overall issue as well as the specific chapters, and a link for a satisfaction survey. We will also be developing a very short video content of this to share widely. So thank you very much, everyone, and please feel free to reach out for any additional information, and let's keep discussing and putting this on the agenda. Thank you very much. Have a good day.